Most of these people truly desire to harvest their olive trees as they have for hundreds of years. Most of these people truly desire to raise their kids, not to throw stones or Molotov cocktails, but to study in peace, to play in peace, and raise a flag, their own flag, and facing that flag to cry as we did. That night then, excited as we were, and we have no right in the world to rob them of this desire, this flag, these tears which always come after all the others.
I'm a Jew. I was born in Germany, and I spent my entire childhood under Hitler, going to segregated schools, not being allowed to sit on park benches. My father, on Kristallnacht, was taken to Dachau. I was the one who opened the door to the Gestapo, so that even though my parents and I escaped finally and came to the United States, we lost almost the entire rest of our family. And I find, as a Jew with that background, that I simply cannot accept the treatment of Palestinians, both inside Israel as second-class citizens and in the West Bank and Gaza as an occupied people. What I can't accept is the Jews, who should know better, who've been on the receiving end throughout all their history, are now apparently identifying with an aggressor that no longer exists, i.e. what the Germans did to Jews, and are in many instances visiting on the Palestinians the kind of treatment that any human rights organization would condemn immediately.
To do that then at the expense of an indigenous people who've been in that place for uncountable generations, and to act towards them as though the one thing that the Jewish people claims to have achieved, namely a national identity of their own, and to deny precisely that same thing to another people who've been in place for an awfully long time, for a couple of thousand years, strikes me Jewishly as well as politically as intolerable as betrayal of the central Jewish imperative to justice.
Well, I think it's important historically for Jews, wherever they are, to associate themselves with the cause of justice, just to begin with. I think that's really a significant part of Jewish identity at its fullest expression.
There's my kind of political analysis and view of the treatment, which is basically that it is a violation of all kinds of international law and of human rights. And then there's the more personal level, which is my moral outrage, that has more to do with my own background, the experiences I had, what it meant to be a Jew, which was having a kind of conscience. My father was a rabbi when I was born, and I think that above all what that did is it gave me a kind of political consciousness and a sense of justice. So at a very deep personal level, I am morally offended and outraged.
With the formation of a Jewish state in 1948, Jews established a national identity and homeland where they believed they could be safe. Much of the world community, shocked by the unbelievable horrors of the Holocaust, encouraged the establishment of this Jewish state of Israel in what had been British-ruled colonial Palestine. However, it quickly became clear that while the Zionist movement had succeeded in establishing a homeland for the Jewish people, it had done so at the expense of the Palestinian people. This basic conflict between Jewish and Palestinian nationalisms has continued, punctuated by periodic warfare and ongoing confrontations ever since.
Yet, the world seems to look on and use the Holocaust as an excuse to allow Israel to continue in this path. And I find it appalling, and I'm trying to do what I can in my very small way to counteract it.
Let us start preparing our defense. We will need it soon enough. Those who actually did it, and those who still do. All those who hushed it up, and those who still do. And those who said nothing, and those who clucked their tongue, saying, something must be done really, but not tonight. I have a concert, a gala event, a birthday. Indeed, we'll all get our summons one day for the colonel's trials.
All along, the Israeli occupying forces have had to rely on oppressive instruments, as most occupying countries do when they're faced with a hostile population. The intensity of this hostility has been aggravated both by the density of the population, by the poverty, and by the long period under which this supposedly temporary circumstance of occupation has been continued. And that's led to a whole series of abuses of human rights and of the basic dignity of the Palestinian people. Mass detentions of Palestinians on suspicion, administrative detention without real criminal charges, the use of collective punishment.
You have a case of not of the violation of rights of the people, but of really an outright denial. Now, increasingly, and ominously, the Israeli right is dropping the hypocritical arguments, ceasing to bother to say things like in 1948 they all ran away, in 1956 we were attacked by Egypt, and the rest of it. They're not bothering with any of this. They're simply saying, this land is ours, given to us by God, no one else has any rights here at all. They're lucky we let them stay even as workers, and they have no rights that are not provisional.
Nearly 2 million Palestinians live in the so-called occupied territories: East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, lands occupied by Israel since the 1967 war. In 1988, during the first year of the Intifada, over 290 Palestinians were killed. To put this in perspective, it would be equivalent to nearly 50,000 Americans killed by an occupying foreign army in just 1 year alone, nearly as many Americans killed as during the entire Vietnam War. When comparing the Palestinian population in the occupied territories to a country the size of the U.S., the number of Americans who would have been shot or beaten to death since the Intifada began is approaching 250,000. Over 15 million Americans would have been severely injured, and over 250,000 American homes would have been blown up, all in addition to the economic, social, and political privations of daily life under military occupation.
The Israeli treatment of the Palestinians is really a negation. In order for Zionism to be consistent, it has to say either that there is no other national question in Palestine, in other words, that there are no Palestinians, that there's no problem, that it really is a land without a people, or if it's to be honest with itself, it has to admit that there is another people, but they don't have the same rights as Jewish people do. Now, in the modern world, neither of these things is very attractive to say. Whichever of these excuses is employed, it's a negation. And as a result, it commits Israel to a state of permanent war.
America's involvement with Israel has been long, complex, and unique. U.S. ties to the Middle East have grown more intimate and complicated since the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. When the colonial spheres of influence waned after both world wars, the superpowers exploited regional tensions to their advantage in fierce competition over land and resources, primarily oil, and the enormous wealth in the form of petrodollars that it created.
American policy is based upon the succession by the United States in the Middle East of the role that used to be played or the part that used to be played, the position occupied by British and French imperialism. And it bears very much the hallmarks of that inheritance. It's based on divide and rule. It's based on the sponsorship of conflict in the region, though it represents itself as one of mediation. It has a clear and declared interest, very well summarized, I think, by Henry Kissinger during the Iran-Iraq War, when he was asked what America's policy was. He said, our policy is that they both lose. You couldn't have a better example of divide and rule, in other words, than the language of the Balfour Declaration, to which, in some sense, all the Western powers are formally committed.
The Monroe Doctrine was extended to large parts of the world after the Second World War, and in particular it was extended to the Middle East, which was described by the State Department right after the Second World War as the most important area in the world in the field of foreign investment, as General Eisenhower described it, the strategically most important area in the world because of its enormous energy reserves, which have two crucial features. First of all, whoever has influence and control over them has a considerable amount of leverage in world affairs. And secondly, there's a huge flow of capital that comes from the profits.
In recent years, America's unprecedented support of Israel has resulted in the nation which prides itself as the beacon of democracy defending a state which has engaged in some very brutal, oppressive, and grossly undemocratic practices.
I'm concerned with primarily and centrally with the position of the United States of America on this, with the radical and total incontinence of the kind of all-out support, subsidy, arming, and so on that we give to Israel, given the fact that what they're doing to the Palestinians completely, flagrantly, and all but declaredly in terms violates the commitments of this nation to the aims and to the criteria of good government.
To me, what's so wrong is here we have a country of which I'm a citizen and a proud citizen that prides itself on humane treatment, on democracy, on not abusing the powers of government, and yet we condone in Israel, whom we call the only democratic power in the Middle East, we condone things there that we would never condone anywhere else. And to me, that's wrong.
The concept of liberty, the concept in the name of heaven of the pursuit of happiness has no application to the Palestinians now. The concept of the consent of the governed is just a joke. Yet those are the things that the United States is supposed to be dedicated to.
Despite the seeming complexities of shifting alliances and global security strategies, a clear and reasonably just solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has evolved in recent years.
It's absolutely necessary to be perfectly clear that the only reasonable resolution of the conflict is to recognize the national rights of both peoples, and that means the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, more or less in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with Israel's borders being the ones that it had before the June 1967 war. This is certainly not a perfect resolution, and it's certainly not perfect with regard to the Palestinian sense of grievance. It represents the only realistic resolution which contains within it the possibility of giving meaningful national rights to both peoples. And this is, of course, the international consensus, and has been for some time, perhaps a decade or more. The two main dissenters from that international consensus are, of course, Israel and the United States.
In an absolutely ideal world, Palestine would be the common treasury and commonwealth of all the people who live in it, and it could have any name it liked, but no one would rule it in the name of any monotheism. I think partition has an unfortunate history. Again, it's generally speaking, it's the outcome of British colonialism. It's the logical outcome of a divide and rule policy, the British policy in the region as you know, was always to say, and in other parts of the empire too, partition is the last thing we'll do, and then it was the last thing they did. However, it can be pragmatically a solution, and I think that there is no other way of vindicating the competing claims of two national groups.
But Israel and the United States, as its strategic protector and financial sponsor, have steadfastly refused to consider this option. In the UN, the proposition of a two-state solution has been continually raised and overwhelmingly supported year after year. Supported, that is, by every country except Israel and its benefactor, the United States.
The traditional U.S. policy has been, as I said, rigid opposition to the peace process. Rigid, inflexible, invariant opposition to the peace process, which is why it never gets anywhere. If you look at for example, you could start with the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly has a vote they meet every winter, and they have a vote every year on advancing the peace process. I won't run through the whole record, but the last one was December 1990, when the vote was 144 to 2, United States and Israel, and that's the way it is all the way back. It's always something like that, N to 2, where N is everybody who wasn't asleep that day or something like that. And 2 is the United States and Israel. Sometimes it varies a little. In 1989, it was 151 to 3 for completely unexplained reasons. Dominica joined with the United States and Israel. Maybe somebody has some insight into that. But in effect, it's the U.S. and Israel blocking the peace process at the General Assembly.
We talk so much in the United States about obeying UN resolutions. We went to war in the Gulf against Iraq because Iraq wouldn't obey a UN resolution. But Israel can flout UN resolutions and nothing happens.
The colonels' trials are coming. Their time will come. It must be so. The trials of the generals, the colonels, and the division, the battalion, and the platoon commanders. There's no escaping it. This is how history works. What shall we say then? What will the colonels, the captains, the corporals say? What will they say of those terrible beatings, the brutality, of houses blown up, and most of all, the humiliation of old men forced to wipe off the writing on the walls, of old men forced to take down a flag from an electric pole, who got electrocuted or fell and broke their legs, of the old water carrier whom soldiers ordered off his donkey and rode on his back, just for fun.
The consequences of continued denial of basic Palestinian claims to independence and equal rights have already been tragic, and if not rectified soon, are likely to have further dire consequences in the near future.
That's just a disaster in the making. I think the only way that peaceful and normal relations between the Israelis and Palestinians in that area will ever come about is if the Palestinians get to, have an independent state in which they can determine their own fate, and the Israelis are left in their own state.
I believe that the policies that Israel has espoused virtually since its beginnings, with particular force against since 1967, will ultimately result in a second and possibly terminal Holocaust.
Well, I think for America, it is possible that America may be pushed into a war. For Israel, I think it's disastrous, because each day that goes by that more Palestinian children grow up with hatred, more Jewish children grow up with hatred, the further away the day is when the two can sit down together and make peace.
It also is the region of the world where, if there is ever going to be a nuclear conflict, it's likeliest to originate. This means that it's a responsibility for any thinking person to concern themselves with the issue of justice and how defined as security.
A settlement must be reached for the well-being of both the Palestinians and the Israelis. And because of its long-standing interest, support, and influence in Israeli affairs, the United States should play a key role. it is not sufficient to proclaim a peace process. The U.S. should catalyze a real peace process based on the basic principles of self-determination, democracy, and support for international law. Yet despite American influence on Israeli policy, presidents from Truman to Bush have refused to deal honestly or effectively with the core issues of the conflict, the crucial need to fulfill Palestinian aspirations for independence just as Israeli aspirations have been accommodated.
I think there's one very basic thing that has to be remembered right from the start, and that is that the fact that the U.S. has already been giving aid to Israel, and in such substantial amounts, has been affecting Israeli policy. Supporters of Israel try to claim now that if the U.S. threatens the withdrawal of aid if Israel doesn't do something like halt settlements in the occupied territories, that's impermissible interference in internal Israeli policy decisions. By implication, claiming that the continued flow of aid does not constitute any kind of interference. I think that's wrong, and it couldn't be more wrong. Nothing could be more wrong than that. The fact that the Israelis have been getting such large amounts of aid until now allows the Israeli government to pursue policies that otherwise the population probably would have opposed, or opposed more strongly than it does. The settlements in the occupied territory, continued occupation, these are very costly policies. And if the Israelis had to pay, if the Israeli citizens had to pay the true cost of these policies, I suspect that they would have opposed them in greater numbers than they oppose them now. The U.S. has been funding these policies for a long time, and therefore it hasn't already been influencing the Israeli politics. And all we're calling for now is that the influence be in a more positive direction, in our point of view. Actually, if you think about it in these terms, then perhaps withdrawal of aid would be the way to really not influence Israeli policy, to allow the Israelis to live with the consequences of what they're doing, which I believe would cause them to change their line.
The issue of aid is, I think, a critical issue. But the last time that I went back in this past summer, which was my fourth visit since the beginning of the Intifada, I was absolutely astounded. It had been a year and a half since I'd been back, at the amount of settlements and the land confiscations. It was truly overwhelming. You read about it, but when you see it, no matter which way you looked, in a lot of villages, there were settlements or the hilltops had been scraped for settlements. Roads that were being bulldozed through, olive groves that had been confiscated all around East Jerusalem. Something that's not talked about a lot except with the Silwan occupation. But basically what's happening is de facto there is going to be no more Palestine. It's very clear. There's going to be nothing left. There's virtually going to be nothing left of East Jerusalem within a couple of months if it keeps up. And this can't be accomplished without U.S. aid.
If the Israelis, who are a real political society, and in my opinion, in their own internal affairs, a fairly functioning democracy still, were forced to choose between paying for the occupation themselves or not paying for it, I think it's obvious that the arguments of those who are against occupying the territory of others on principle would be strengthened. So I regard it really as an act of solidarity with those in Israel who are opposed to the occupation to say that the United States should not finance the extreme right in Israel. And what this is a concealed subsidy to militarism, to the settlers, to the fanatics, and to the racists. And this, in the end, will doom the democratic and secular forces in Israel itself, to whom one also has a duty of solidarity.
Because the U.S. government refuses to change its basic policies and refuses to support Palestinian independence, the pressure for change must come from the American public, as it has in the past when the American government pursued policies of war and oppression, as in South Africa and Vietnam.
It's quite clear, and it's been the case for some time, that the United States is the main arena where actions can produce a meaningful change. Certainly for the early years of the Intifada, it was the Palestinians who engaged in the Intifada that took the initiative, that changed the political balance of forces that created openings that did change the political parameters of the conflict. My feeling now is that the Intifada has not completely run its course, but essentially accomplished what it could accomplish given the existing balance of forces, and that means that the other arenas are the ones where further steps need to be taken, and given the political paralysis in Israel, it means that the United States is the main arena in which change is possible and necessary. Now, the American Jewish community could, in fact, play a very important and constructive role in this regard. And I would put it even in very simple terms. If people actually spoke out and said what it is that they really do believe, if American Jews, and especially American Jewish leaders, who already have, to some extent, a critique of Israeli policies, would simply speak out and make that known and make it publicly available for the general American community, that would give increased permission to non-Jews to share that same criticism, no more, no less. And that would create the public possibility for the American government to do more than it has done to this date in the way of putting pressure on Israel. And I think we need to be absolutely clear. Without American pressure, Israeli policy simply will not change. So all of the constructions of how things will happen without direct application of American pressure are, in my view, completely fanciful.
I do think the United States is a centrally important forum to discuss these problems. What American intellectuals generally, and Jewish intellectuals in particular, can do is to continue to break down the monopoly of perceptions that Zionist and Israeli rhetoric has had in this country, to make that increasing sense of divided mind, at least in the American Jewish community, clear also to the Israelis, who have used the American Jewish community as simply a sounding board for their own policies and a lobbying instrument for their own policies, well-advised or ill-advised.
We know from the highly sanitized State Department records of the widespread violation of human rights, violations of the Geneva Convention, yet we continue to give aid. So in fact, it's illegal, I believe, for us to continue giving aid. And at the same time, what it does is continue to support ultimately Israeli annexation of what little is left of Palestine.
I fail to see why there is no change in the administration's policy, because everything that Israel has adamantly done, such as the settlements that continue, could have been stopped if we stopped financing it.
While massive geopolitical changes have occurred in recent years, changes that have to some degree affected the way the U.S. uncritically supports Israeli policy, major institutional problems still remain in the U.S., preventing support for the two-state solution. A large component of this problem is the portrayal of all American Jews as uncritical supporters of Israeli policy, an image of a powerful monolithic bloc that most politicians are unwilling to challenge.
I think one of the most important things is publicly speaking out as Jews. I think in many ways, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, we're listened to in a different sort of way. I think we have to break through the notion that these other people speak for Jews and speak for the Jewish community in the United States. As Jews, we are also part of that community, and I think it's critical that we identify ourselves and start taking action to show that there are other voices.
The so-called Israeli lobby has a big influence in intimidating people. I mean, the main thing they've achieved is not so much lobbying the executive as intimidating everybody else. So people know that if you open your mouth, you're going to get a ton of mud thrown at you and this and that. And, you know, that makes people back away, particularly in public life. And that's had an effect. It's doubtless had an effect on portrayal of the whole issue.
I think there is a large segment of the Jewish community that is being spoken for by Jewish organizations with which they have nothing to do and have nothing in common. Nobody's speaking for me and my point of view, except JCOM. And I think the more those of us who feel very strongly on this issue and who want to see our country, the United States, do the right thing, it behooves us to speak out and to let the more or less ignorant public, general public, know that not all Jews are solidly behind U.S. policy in regard to Israel. That is not to say that as Jews we wish any harm to come to Israel. On the contrary, most of us feel that Israel would be in a much stronger and more secure position if it made peace with its Arab neighbors and with the Palestinians.
In the last 15 years or so, almost no flexibility or evolution of policy. Maybe no is too strong a word, but very little, very modest shifts in outlook. And the influence that Israel and the Jewish lobby have been able to exert on the U.S. Congress has created a certain kind of constraint on the degrees of freedom that an American president seems able to exercise. I think that from what I know of U.S. public opinion, it would be prepared for a relatively dramatic shift in U.S. policy toward this cluster of issues. And I think a strong president could make a very successful case that the peace process requires a break with the past, that Israeli security, reasonably considered, depends on finding a solution to the Palestinian search for self-determination, and that we have in the aftermath of the Gulf War an unprecedented opportunity to really resolve these questions for the benefit of all, and that the rigidity of the Israeli government in the governing process should no longer be an inhibition on U.S. policy.
There has historically been considerable dissension within the Jewish community worldwide, both toward Zionist attitudes, which have often been racist and colonial, as well as Israeli policies. In the past, speaking about Palestinian statehood and reducing support for Israel has been done more in private than in public. Only recently have American Jews begun to make themselves heard on these issues.
There was always a trend within the Zionist movement until 1948 that argued that the creation of an exclusivist Jewish state would be a mistake and would produce consequences which are more or less what Israel has become.
There are groups in Israel on the left, more progressive side who have in fact called for cessation or reduction of aid, or if not called for it, have expressed satisfaction that something like this may take place. And for many years now, I've witnessed, and I'm sure many others have seen, liberal Israeli groups or representatives of those groups come to the U.S. and complain to the establishment of the Jewish community here in the U.S. that their support for the Israeli government, regardless of its policies, which they explain by saying they don't want to interfere in internal Israeli politics, in fact constitute an extremely powerful interference because they allow the government to pursue policies which are the policies of some portion of the Israeli public.
For Israel to change its policy, it must be coerced. It is our duty to call upon the U.S. to stop giving money to Israel. Israeli Jews like myself join with JCOM, and I'm delighted that such a committee exists in the U.S., to urge a suspension of American aid to Israel until Israel agrees to cease the occupation.
On no other issue in the United States are the intellectual classes, as you might define them, the weekly and monthly magazines, senior academics, liberal commentators, and so on, so much part of the national security consensus as they are on the question of the Middle East. it's sometimes frightening to notice the extent to which axiomatic assumptions of the Israeli government are taken as objectivity by people who allegedly are qualified to take part in the debate.
I think the media has tended to magnify that sense of a sort of monolithic Jewish attitude toward these issues. And so it becomes extremely important for individuals who can speak authentically as Jews to present an alternative conception of how Jews feel about these issues.
There's a more than usual difficulty in getting the opinions of those who aren't part of this consensus onto the air or into print. One of the difficulties is that the media, generally speaking, has a responsibility for consensus and both reinforces it and takes its point of departure from it. The simplest example is that it's considered editorially okay to report the movements of Mr. James Baker, that great statesman, and to describe them as a peace mission. In other words, if you open your paper or you turn on your radio or your television, you will read or be told, Mr. Baker left today on a peace mission to the Middle East. Now that is an editorial judgment of the very kind that the ideology of objectivity is supposed to shield you against, supposed to be protected from outright editorializing on the news pages. But there it is. It is assumed that Mr. Baker's intentions are benign, that the United States is a disinterested superpower doing its best with a bunch of desperados in the Middle East who, you know, it's a miracle if they'll even sit down together and talk. Extraordinary. I mean, the condescension and the racism underlying it are quite something to behold. However, because the argument has to be conducted in this way, and because if the dread thought that the United States had interests of its own in the region, and that peace might not be the principal one, was ever allowed, I don't see how they would manage to report the subject. I mean, I don't know, they've never tried, so we can't tell. But it wouldn't be solved by just getting Noam Chomsky on Nightline, because if you say, there's Noam on Nightline, I set the scene for you, or Israel Shahak is on, Ted Koppel is in the chair, or maybe Henry Kissinger is chairing the discussion that night, who knows? Comes the question, well, Professor Chomsky, do you think it would be in our interests for us to attach conditions to the loan guarantees? And bear in mind that we're running out of time. Noam would have to begin by saying, who's this we? What are our interests? What are they guaranteeing with this loan? You're out of time already. It isn't, in other words, solved by adding an intelligent person to the panel, something that admittedly isn't very often tried. The whole vernacular in which the thing is described is basically an imperial one with the racial assumptions that go along with it and the intellectual standards that are necessary for it, which are very dull and very low.
I have been accused, as everyone who says these things has been accused, of being a self-hating Jew and an anti-Semite and a betrayer of the Jewish people and the like. While it is painful to hear that sort of thing, I rest very easy in rejecting those kinds of foolish and foul-mouthed imputations. The fact of the matter is, I'm a child of the Holocaust. I escaped Hitler, Berlin, in just before World War II. I am deeply conscious of modern Jewish history. It is in my very bones and bloodstream. I have not the slightest hesitancy to say that I stand where I stand out of my own consciousness as a Jew, that if you take my Jewish self-identity away, I disappear. I'm not worried about those imputations.
One of the unfortunate tactics that was pursued by the mainstream Zionist community in the United States was to try to create the impression that all Jews shared a attitude of unconditional support for the Israeli state, and that anyone who seemed to depart from that publicly and visibly had to be castigated.
I think the most important thing that people can do, and this is not a prescription for activity. It's more along the lines of a general direction, is let those in their communities, those who represent them in Congress and elsewhere, and the world at large know that Jews are not monolithic on these issues, that Jews, many Jews believe that Israel's policies are not to be condoned, in fact, ought to be reversed. I believe that it's easier for Jews to do that than it is for non-Jewish progressives to do that. Non-Jewish progressives, I think, tread very lightly on Israel because they don't want to be tarred with the brush of anti-Semitism. And so they are uncharacteristically quiet when it comes to Israel. That places a special obligation on Jews who are understood to have the standing to speak out against those with whom they share history and religion, to speak for not only themselves but all other progressives who aren't so willing to step forward.
However, the situation in the Middle East becomes ever more inextricably tied to the U.S., especially in terms of the oil-based economy. More and more people, both Jews and non-Jews, are realizing that in good conscience they must come forward to speak out against oppressive U.S. and Israeli policies and in favor of Palestinian independence. Given America's pivotal role in supporting Israeli policies, constant pressure by American citizens on their own government is the only way meaningful political change can be brought about.
But as long as we pour the money in, what need is there for Israel to change its policy?
JCOM, the Jewish Committee on the Middle East, was established to give a desperately needed forum to independent American Jews to speak out and be heard. A forum to make it clear to the American people and to American policymakers that many concerned and knowledgeable American Jews, while strongly supporting Israel's right to exist, believe that the Palestinian people are also entitled to freedom and self-determination. I'm Mark Bruzonsky, founder and chairperson of JCOM and former Washington representative of the World Jewish Congress at a time, just a few years ago, when the WJC leadership also supported Palestinian statehood and peaceful coexistence between the Israelis and the Palestinians. JCOM's board of advisors is made up of prominent American Jews, some of whom you have just heard from, and many of whom teach about the Middle East at major American universities. In the past few years, thousands of Americans, Jews and non-Jews alike, from diverse backgrounds, have come forward to support JCOM's positions and statements. Jewish professors at over 170 universities throughout the nation are publicly on record now supporting the basic positions JCOM is advocating: Palestinian statehood and clear changes in American Middle East policies.
Well, I think the initial importance of JCOM was to say in a clear voice, without a whole lot of qualifications, that there was a Jewish constituency that was prepared to speak out in the United States on behalf of justice for the Palestinians, and that it was doing this with the in the conviction that it was in furtherance of the sort of Israel that was believed to be most desirable from both the point of view of the United States and from the point of view of the people living in Israel.
I think JCOM is important because it is a voice of thoughtful and Jewishly self-conscious American Jews who essentially share that general sense of the profound discontent with which Israel deals with the issue of Palestinian nationhood, and who say it out of a commitment to Jewish existence, out of a commitment to Jewish values, to their own sense of their own Jewishness, rather than out of hostility to Jewish consciousness and history. That, I think, is a significant contribution.
I think that it was really important to create that sense that there is another outlook that isn't only a matter of the expression given by political extremists who don't value their Jewish identity. See, I think one of the things about JCOM that has some political relevance is that it is an attempt to speak out on these issues, but to do so with pride about Jewish identity.
Jews are anxious enough about their own place in the scheme of Western history and of world history generally, such that they look with great nervousness at those voices that are deeply critical of Israeli and Jewish policies that come from elsewhere. It seems to me important to give the general American community, the American Jewish community, as well as also the Israelis and Palestinian communities, some sense that there are Jews who, for Jewishly substantive reasons, coherent Jewish substantive reasons, share the sense that the Palestinian claim to human rights and to political independence is a legitimate claim of equal, at least equal value as that of the Jewish, modern Jewish political claim to nationhood.
Within Jewish culture and tradition, there is, in my view, a tremendous emphasis on community service, justice, and again, social consciousness. And many of us who had a religious upbringing learned about these things through attendance at religious schools or religious services, or in my case, primarily through the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, AZA. We were taught as teenagers to look to those less fortunate in our society and find a way to serve them. And I'd like to see a greater emphasis on those concepts of justice and service. And I think this issue is one which will allow us to emphasize those positive aspects of Jewish culture, and JCOM is an organization that I think can help bring that about.
Usually when we're in a group of Jews or a group of American non-Jews, find we're in a minority and we don't have any support. So JCOM gives us the feeling that there are others. It's like a support group, I guess you could call it. And I think the fact that it makes our viewpoint known, especially to young people on university campuses and through ads to a larger public.
The hold of tribalism on the Jews is sometimes seems incredibly strong. The feeling that there should be no public debate that can be summarized in the stupid old folk saying, "not in front of the goyim," is a powerful reinforcement to silence and complicity, as it is in all tribes. But it's the job of anyone as a member of whatever tribe they are to resist that kind of thinking. As a matter of fact, you don't have to believe Jews are smarter than anyone else, or more humorous, or more cynical, or whatever it might be, or more committed to irony, to notice that actually there is such a thing as a Jewish conscience. And that even under really quite difficult conditions in Israel, there has never been a consensus about the dispossession and maltreatment of the Palestinians, and there still isn't.
For some years now, JCOM has spearheaded an important campaign to build understanding and support for these positions. This campaign has included over 100 magazine and newspaper ads along with ongoing radio and TV appearances. We bring views and opinions routinely ignored or overlooked by the mainstream media to the public's attention. we try to honestly inform the American public about what is really happening in the Middle East and the realities of U.S. involvement in the region. We advocate a fundamental change in American foreign policy, emphasizing what those policies should be rather than what they have been and remain today. When no journal or magazine would publish an article by the renowned Professor Charles Black, "Let Us Rethink Our Special Relationship with Israel," JCOM stepped forward to do so.
I think with what we have, we're having a reasonable impact. I constantly am approached by people write me notes, things like that, who see our ads, who mostly express happiness that there is some organization that they feel speaks for their views. So we're talking mostly about Jewish Americans who have always been unhappy with the way the Jewish establishment here has supported Israeli positions that they felt that they were opposed to.
I think that the events of the Intifada and the change of the PLO position has led many more Jews to feel enough confidence both in the importance of taking an independent position and of its viability and solidity to do so. And so I think there is a more favorable atmosphere for an organization like JCOM at the present time. And I think that it will be vindicated in its basic vision by the historical process that is unfolding at the present time.
We turned a deaf ear. We turned a deaf heart, mean, arrogant, and dumb. Who do we think we are to be so deaf, so dumb, ignoring the obvious? They are as human as we are, at least as we used to be. Only 40 years ago, no less diligent, no less smart, as sensitive, as full of hope, they love their wives and children as we do, no less. And our children now shoot theirs with lead, plastic, bullets, and gas. The Palestinian state will come to pass. It will. Not a poet wrote this, history will. And the seasons will come, and seasons will go, and life goes on as we very well know, weddings and birth and death all the same, but just the shame of it, the shame.
تمسح الحزن عن المساجد يا ليلة الإسراء يا درب من مروا إلى السماء عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم وإنني أصلي الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان
accept the fact that not everything that goes on in Israel is good.
If people actually spoke out and said what it is that they really do believe.
A nation that oppresses another nation is not itself going to be free.
There are other voices.
But when it's Israel, there seems to be silence, and that silence has to be broken.
This people exists, and outright, young and old, male and female, Christian, Muslim, secular, doesn't matter, with one voice say, we refuse to continue living under the conditions you mandate for us. We decline. We will take the risk of death every day to defy it. Where on earth did all that come from?
For the past 5 years, the Palestinian people have been engaged in a national uprising for their freedom and independence. The same freedom and independence that Americans fought for 200 years ago. But for decades now, the daily reality for the Palestinians has been a brutal military occupation, unlike anywhere else in the world. The Palestinian uprising, the Intifada as it is called in Arabic, has been the understandable and justifiable response to this situation. There are over 5 million Palestinians in the world today. About half still live in their homeland, some as second-class citizens in the Jewish state of Israel, most under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Mostly as a result of their expulsion during the wars of 1948 and 1967, the other half were scattered in a Palestinian diaspora in countries throughout the Middle East, as well as in Europe, Latin America, and the US. Though the term Intifada is new, the Palestinians have been fighting for their independence throughout the century. Before World War I, the Ottoman Turks controlled Palestine and much of the Arab world. Back then, European governments were publicly claiming to support Arab independence, while actually planning in secret to balkanize and control the region for their own gain. After World War I, Britain and France took control of large parts of the Arab world, including Palestine. The victorious Western powers, now led by the United States, further conspired to continue the previous colonial policies after World War II. In 1947, prompted by the desperate conditions of the Jewish survivors of the European Holocaust, the Western-dominated United Nations narrowly voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state. It was in this overall context that Israel came into existence in 1948, but only after a bloody civil war that pitted the Jewish and Arab populations against each other. Ever since that time, rather than advocating democracy and self-determination, Israel and Western countries have continually manipulated Arab politics to keep client regimes in power and to prevent Palestinian self-determination. The Palestinian people, of course, have been among the major victims of these international intrigues. Though among the most educated and cultured people in the region, the Palestinian people have been reduced to refugees and laborers, with both their country and their freedom taken from them. Today, unlike anywhere else in the world, the Palestinians have lived for more than 25 years under a foreign military occupation that continually attempts to rob them of their national and cultural identity while literally beating them into submission. Large numbers of Palestinians have been killed or badly injured. Many others have been arrested, sometimes tortured, often subjected to terribly degrading treatment. Moreover, unlike anywhere else in the world, the people of the United States make possible this grossly unjust military occupation through huge military and economic subsidies to Israel, nearly $5 billion each year in recent years. There are today over 100 Palestinian refugee camps throughout the Middle East, the majority of them inside the occupied territories and thus controlled by the Israeli army.
This is the Dheisheh refugee camp, where displaced Palestinians have been living since 1948, when the Arab-Israeli War forced them to flee from their homes and lands. They came and settled here on the outskirts of Bethlehem, in a camp sponsored by the United Nations. Since June 1967, when Israel invaded the West Bank, they've been living under military occupation.
The occupation is a very brutal state of being. It's a deprivation of a whole people of their right to freedom, of their right to dignity, to human dignity, of their right to life, of their right to freedom of expression, of their most basic human and national rights. This occupation is much more insidious because it attempts to deprive the Palestinians of their humanity and of their national identity. So in many ways it has been a drawn-out, long holding of a whole population as a hostage to be manipulated by Israel for its political ends. It is brutal in terms of its military effects, in terms of the loss of life. It's very cruel in terms of the deliberate and brutal demolition of houses, in terms of the massive detentions of people, especially people without charges, without evidence for long periods of time. It is also brutal in its policy of imposing military sieges and curfews and attempting to totally destroy the Palestinian infrastructure and the very fabric of Palestinian society.
In the Palestinian struggle against occupation, the 7,000 people of Dheisheh camp are very active, and they pay a heavy price.
وين أبوك يا حبيبتي؟
مات
وين طخ؟
الجيش
وين طخ؟
في راسه.
A bullet came through the window.
لكن الشباب حاملي وأنا شفته عند يوسف وشفته وهو حاطين عليه الإحرام ودوا على القبر.
It was a very dangerous wound. He was shot at a close range. The bullet entered his forehead from the left side and settled in the brain. They got the bullet out and told me that Lutfi will live, but he will live half paralyzed, with 50% of his body not functioning.
Lutfi is 18 years old. He was shot in the head with what the Israelis call a rubber bullet, a heavy metal slug with thin rubber coating. As the oldest son, Lutfi was the family's main hope that he would become somebody and help support them.
The girls came running and said, "Muhammad was shot." I said, "Where did he get shot?" They said, "In the stomach." His friends wrapped him in a cloth and took him to the hospital. He came out of the operation making the victory sign. The doctor said he wouldn't live to see tomorrow, that he would die at any moment.
Muhammad was 17 when he was shot. The bullet entered his midsection and shattered. He underwent 4 operations, the last one in America, where the surgeons removed most of his stomach. For 2 years, Muhammad could not eat in a normal way. He lived on food packets attached to his side. He became a legend on the West Bank.
I knew it. I felt it. The minute they shot him, he would become a martyr. But we were happy for Muhammad, that he lived for 2 more years and that he traveled to America and to Jordan and spent time with his friends. Thank God he kept him alive for us for those 2 years so he could be with us. The soldier who shot him was surprised. He said, "Muhammad did not die? He did not die? I shot him so that he could die immediately."
The boys and young men in the camp throw stones at the soldiers constantly, as a never-ending reminder to the Israelis that the occupation must end.
The boys threw stones from top of this building on the soldiers. Then the soldiers blew up the home.
The Intifada is a massive human response to a very inhuman situation. It's a popular upheaval. It's a popular movement whereby the people have overcome their own sense of fear and have responded to the unnatural state of the occupation with a very natural and human expression and civilized expression of determination and persistence.
We are born to give. We are for the Palestinian homeland. We're not afraid of the violence they use against us. We're not stopping our struggle until we achieve our goals and get what's right. First, a person should serve the goal of his people, then comes his own. This is what I think. We have to liberate Palestine. When Palestine is liberated, then we can have our own independent personal lives. As long as there's an occupation, we have no personal lives. I intend to do many things, assuming I don't go to prison or get shot and killed. No one knows. I have no guarantee that I'll live to see tomorrow. Our goals are to be engineers, doctors, everything. This is our ambition. Can it happen under the occupation? They took me to court after holding me for 40 days. In court, the judge sentenced me to 40 days and fined me 500 shekels. When I said I wouldn't pay, then he sentenced me to another month in prison. After that, I was released. My life is the least I can give for Palestine.
بتلبس حطة لا أول شيء بلبس حطة تتكنى عشان نشوف مش الكنابل نقعد نرجم
هذا لما تكبر
لا احنا وياه نكبر ننام ونحط حطة لا نعلق إعلام هيك نعلق إعلام فوق ونعلق على عمدان إعلام فلسطين
The women, children, and young men do these marches to strengthen their determination, to boast of their courage, to demand freedom and a normal life. But it can be a march of death. The Israeli government has authorized its soldiers to shoot any masked person on sight. Most of the young men and children wear the masks to show their defiance.
I would like my children to have a normal childhood, to go to school, to be able to live without fear, without insecurity. I would like to be able to meet my students, to teach them, to be able to have the luxury of reading and writing academically, of practicing what I've been trained to do, and to know that we have worked for this and guaranteed a secure future for our children.
The children of the Dheisheh camp grow up knowing nothing except life under military occupation. They see what the soldiers do to their fathers, brothers, sisters, and cousins. They see the future that occupation offers them. The odds are that they or someone near and dear to them will be imprisoned, or beaten, or killed, or crippled. Their teacher says they have a problem with the children. They take their make-believe guns and play their game Israelis and Arabs. These children have never run in a park or jumped in a swimming pool or played at the beach. They know what toys look like only because they see them on television. Many young Palestinian men are wanted by the Israeli military authorities. This secret list contains the identification numbers of those wanted. Mohammed's number is on the list. He's 19 years old and has been in prison 7 times. He's been dodging the Israelis for the past 2 years.
We saw that we will end up in prison. Our future is in prison. Because we have always considered ourselves fighters, we will stand in the face of occupation. I spend my days in the streets. At night, it depends on the situation. If it's safe, I might sleep in someone's home. If it's not, I might spend the night on a rooftop. One night, the soldiers raided the home I was staying in. But the soldiers didn't even talk to me. They only wanted the person whose house I was sleeping in. They asked him his name, took him and left. They didn't even ask me my name. It was a scary moment. Everyone who lives a life like mine, and even everyone in the camp, knows that death faces them every day, and easily they could be killed at any moment.
Again, in addition, it's the indignity of being treated like subhuman creatures, of being herded off like cattle, of being cooped up in your houses, of losing not just the freedom of speech and expression, but the freedom of movement, of being deprived of fresh air and sunshine.
The Israelis impose curfews as collective punishment. They can last for a day, a week, a month. This elderly man is sick, but he can't go to a doctor because during curfew, the soldiers lock the camp gate.
When there are curfews, I always bake my own bread. Will I allow my children to be short of food? The intention of the Israelis is to starve us to death. Never. We won't allow it. We won't die of starvation. We challenge them in everything. We are not free to live and build our country. We can't build it because they are oppressing us. But one of these days they will leave. Turkey ruled us and left. Britain came and left. And the Israelis will leave too, God willing.
Well, I would like total independence and freedom, an independent Palestinian state where we can live in dignity and freedom, where we can determine our own lives, where we can restore to our children their stolen childhood.
In the struggle against occupation, the role of the girls is to watch for the soldiers, to supply the demonstrators with stones, and to take food and clothing to the wanted men who can't return to their homes. These girls find their lives totally disrupted.
I finished high school in prison and had no chance to go to college. But I want to learn.
Maher is 25 years old. He spent 4 years of his life in prison for resisting the occupation.
The whole world must know. The American must know. The Brazilian must know. The French must know. And the German must know that we are a part of the human race. We are a part of the human race just like them, and them like us, exactly. We also have feelings, passions, and emotions. Every one of us loves. We struggle because of love. We work on changing our circumstances because of love, in all its aspects. Romantic love and the love of humanity.
I would like to see this whole area deal with its own problems in a genuine and essential way, not through dealing with the symptoms and the outcomes, but through dealing with the long-standing grievances that have been allowed to fester, that have been ignored, or that have been treated in the wrong way. Ultimately, I would like to see this region prosper and develop in freedom and in dignity.
To feel that I exist, that I'm a Palestinian, that I have an identity.
To achieve freedom and self-worth as Palestinians.
The goal we struggle for, a Palestinian state. To get rid of the occupation and have a Palestinian state.
For all the young men who died, the ones in prison, and those wounded. As Palestinians, we want our Palestinian state.
As Jews, I think we should all be appalled to see Jews acting in the way that Israel has acted towards the Palestinians.
I think the least that the United States can do is reduce its aid by the amount which it costs Israel to maintain the occupation.
Just say no to Israel. That's something we seem just to be unable to do.
But as long as we pour the money in, what need is there for Israel to change its policy?
لأجلك يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي